Audio recording for this meeting has begun.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see so many already on the call. We're going to get started in just a minute. My name is Molly Marin. I am the webinar coordinator for the New York State RtI Technical Assistance Center. Just a few reminders before we get started today. A copy of our PowerPoint is available on our webpage, nysrti.org, under Professional Development and then under Webinars. We will record today's meeting, and a copy of that recorded link will be available on our webpage in that same location after today's webinar. Today is, also a reminder about the chat box. Please use the chat box for any questions or comments that you may have during the webinar. At the end of today's presentation, I will post a link to an evaluation. That link will also come via email to you. If you could please take a minute to complete that. It's a very short evaluation, but we do look at those every week and very much appreciate your feedback. Today is the second webinar in our Differentiating Core Instruction within an RtI Framework strand. We are focusing on the how of differentiation, part 1. Part 2 will take place next Monday, May 18th at 4 p.m., and we hope you can come back and join us for part 2 as well. It is my pleasure today to welcome Dr. Jean Wanzak back with us. Dr. Wanzak is an associate professor at Florida State University and on the research faculty at the Florida Center for Reading Research. She is a former special educator and elementary teacher. Dr. Wanzak conducts research examining effective reading instruction and intervention. She has worked with elementary and middle schools across the country to improve core classroom instruction and intervention implementation in a response to intervention model. In addition, she has consulted with schools and districts on the implementation of effective reading instruction. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Wanzak back with us again today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's good to be back with you. Today we're going to discuss ways to differentiate reading instruction through content considerations. And just a reminder that this is a webinar on differentiating reading instruction and doing so within the core reading instruction, which occurs in the elementary grades. So I'm going to provide several examples, and they will all be within reading and at the elementary level. A quick reminder from last week, and for those that are new to the webinar today, about how I'm defining differentiated instruction. I got my arrows mixed up there, sorry about that. In differentiated instruction, we're looking to maximize student learning through the use of ongoing assessment data, which is key to planning instruction, and tailoring instruction to address student needs and allow them to better access the core reading instruction through a variety of flexible grouping formats to address these needs. And that can include matching materials to help them accelerate their learning and be able to access the core better, as well as I mentioned, tailoring the instruction for them. Let's take a moment and consider examples of differentiated instruction under these broad characteristics that we went over last week. I'm going to read through each example, and I want you to note which you think are the examples of differentiated instruction. So arranging the classroom so that student desks are placed in small groups of 3 to 4 students. Is that an example or not of differentiated instruction? Just make a quick note. Engaging a small group of 5 students in additional word recognition instruction. Is that an example or not? Allowing students to choose a partner to work on a word puzzle. Is that an example of differentiated instruction or not? Allowing students to select a topic to read about. Example or not? Providing text for students to read that aligns with the reading practices they have begun to master. Is that an example of differentiated instruction or not? The first one is not an example because there's no tailoring of instruction to meet student needs. It's just a physical grouping format. The second one is an example of differentiated instruction because there is targeted instruction provided to the students, presumably to meet their word recognition needs, and that of course should be based on assessment. The third one, the third bullet, is not an example because the instruction is not tailored to specific student needs when they're choosing that partner. The fourth one is not an example because there is no use of assessment data to plan the instruction. And the fifth one is differentiated instruction because assessment data regarding what students have mastered is used and the materials are tailored to the student needs. So the second and the last bullets are the examples of differentiated instruction. You can compare that to your notes. Okay, let's review the three main categories for differentiated instruction in the core classroom. Remember, these are also ways that you can consider intensifying instruction in supplemental interventions as well. I know some of our participants teach in those areas too. We have organizational considerations, which we discussed last week. We have content considerations that we will be covering today. And we have the most forgotten, which is delivery of instruction considerations, and that we will discuss next week in our final session. So if you were with us last week, you remember that organizational considerations have two parts, determining the grouping, small groups, partners, etc., and determining the time. In general, smaller targeted groups and more time in targeted instruction will increase the intensity of the intervention or the instruction and will accelerate learning. These organizational considerations are probably the most basic aspects of differentiated instruction, the most used in current practice, and the most familiar to teachers. Okay, so now that we've reviewed differentiated instruction and the first category of organizational considerations, let's consider the next aspect of differentiated instruction, which is the content considerations. Students with reading difficulties in the elementary grades may have one or more difficulties interrupting their progress in reading. They may have difficulty with the phonological structure of words, so they may have weak phonics skills or decoding skills in the early grades, or as you get up into third, fourth, and fifth grade, phonics skills that are related to, weak phonics skills that are related to identifying multisyllabic words. They may also, or instead, have limited sight word reading. So they may have the phonics skills, are able to decode, but must go through the process each time. Or perhaps it's particularly words that are irregular, which affects their fluency. They may also have limited practice with text through the years, which can affect their fluency as well. And this is particularly true as we get again into the upper elementary grades. If students either through their difficulties or through their core instruction have had limited practice with text, that can catch up with them over time. Many students with reading difficulties don't get a lot of practice outside of school. They don't necessarily choose to read just for enjoyment, or if they do, they're perhaps not covering as much text as students who are on grade level. Students can have weak vocabulary or oral language, which can start right from the beginning in school to cause them problems as they're trying to learn to read. And that is also related to low background knowledge or concept knowledge, which can affect not only their ability to read print and their fluency with that, but also obviously their comprehension. And students may have difficulty monitoring comprehension, applying specific strategies, making inferences, critically thinking about the text, even if their reading and their fluency of the print is fairly on grade level. So students may have difficulties, as many of you have experienced with your own students, with one or more of these areas, and may have had these difficulties for one or more years, depending on the grade levels that they are in. There are two main places to consider intervening in the core if there are students who are struggling. And one is to consider the content, which is what we're going to focus on today, and the extent to which that is meeting student needs, particularly in terms of what is emphasized. A second is to consider the instructional delivery of the content or effective features of instruction, and we're going to continue to talk about that aspect next week. When we are considering content, we will look first at the student needs based on our assessments, and then within these needs, we will consider what needs are not currently being addressed adequately through the current core instruction. This could be because the need is somewhat unique and not all the students have that need, therefore it's not being addressed in the core. An example might be students in fourth grade who require basic phonics instruction. Or it could be that many students in the class have the need, but for some reason, perhaps it's the materials we're using, the need is not being addressed adequately and students are not making sufficient growth in this area. An example may be reading fluency. Many students could be struggling in this area, but very little time in the core is being devoted to practice reading text and practice with fluency. So content is one area that we can consider adjusting in the core if there are students who are struggling. Adjustments can be made in small group instruction if the target is a few students, or adjustments can be made in large group instruction if there are several students that could benefit. We'll talk about differentiating instruction through emphasizing particular areas in addition to differentiating in small groups. So we have our 5 components of reading that we're all familiar with, and the 2 areas in content I want you to think about with your students. What skills do students who are struggling need now, and what is coming up? That's going to help our planning and differentiated instruction. These are the areas to target. With elementary students, particularly in the early grades, it may be that students only need intervention in a particular component. But think ahead a bit for them too. What is coming up in the core or the whole group lessons that you could prepare them for ahead of time to help them better access that material and succeed? So again, what skills do students who are struggling need now, and what is coming up? And then second, think about high impact skills. There are grade level standards in all of these reading components, and those need to be covered in their entirety in the core. However, there are critical skills in each of these areas that have the highest impact on students' reading progress and will allow them to benefit from other instruction. And those are the areas that we're going to target in our differentiated instruction. Before we talk more about targeting instruction in these areas, let's consider for a moment what you currently know about your core or the core with teachers that you work with. What do you know about how these components in each area are addressed in the core instruction? So how is phonological awareness addressed if that's appropriate for the grade level? How are phonics and word recognition addressed? Fluency, vocabulary and oral language, and comprehension. And then what do you know about how much time is spent on each of these components, either daily or weekly, whichever is easier for you to think about in the core instruction? Jot down this information for each component. I'm going to give you just a minute to do that. Okay, so keep that list with you as we go through and talk some about this high impact instruction. When we are planning differentiated reading instruction, it is important to consider the components, skills, and strategies that have the highest impact on reading achievement. These are practices that make the highest contribution to learning to read and can accelerate learning, which is the goal of differentiated instruction for students who are struggling. In the entire core reading instruction, all of the skills and strategies that are part of the grade level standards must be covered, as we talked about. However, one key thing in content is to consider where the highest impact skills are in the curriculum and whether these high impact skills are receiving emphasis. High impact skills are those that have the largest impact on a student's reading ability. In addition, for students struggling with reading, we want to focus on accelerating student learning during differentiated instruction, as well as their supplemental interventions too, so that students can better access the full core curriculum. And in order to accelerate this student learning, we need to identify the instruction that has the highest impact on building reading achievement so that students can make the gains needed to access all of the core. Thus, these areas should receive more emphasis in the core in general and should be the focus of the targeted instruction within our differentiating. High-impact instruction is also the focus of interventions. Let's look at an example of what I'm talking about here. So I'm going to start with our first component, but I'll go through all of these because obviously phonological awareness is not necessarily something that all students need or are struggling with, I should say. And it's certainly not part of the grade level standards for every grade level either. But let's use this as our initial example, and then I'll show you how it applies to other components too. So phonological awareness is one component of reading that a student may need instruction. You see here a list of the skills that are part of phonological awareness. However, while all of these skills may be part of a kindergarten curriculum, for example, they are not all equally important. The skills on this slide are, generally speaking, in order from least difficult to most difficult. So we have rhyming is, for most kids, the least difficult. Comparison matching discrimination is when I might give a student a couple of words like mat, sat, and can, and I ask them which one sounds different. So they have to discriminate or compare the words to tell which ones are the same or which one is different. Isolation is when we ask orally for a particular sound in a word, what they hear. So I might say, what is the last sound in can? Blending is, of course, when they blend all the sounds to make a word. So I might say the sounds, k, a, n, and ask the student to blend that into a word to know that that is can. And segmenting is the opposite, where I say the word can, and the student needs to be able to say the sounds, k, a, n. And then deletion and substitution, as we said, these are more difficult. They're lower in the list. This is when I might ask a student to delete a sound. What is can when you take away the k? You're left with an, of course. And substitution, what is can when you take away the k and replace it with a What word does it become? We know from research that the ability to blend and segment phonemes in words is actually the most related to future reading outcomes, and that's why those are highlighted there. Other phonological skills like rhyming or saying the first sound of a word may be pre-skills, or they may be scaffolds for students necessary to eventually learn blending and segmenting. But if the students don't get to the blending and segmenting, or if there isn't an emphasis in that area, it won't have the largest possible impact on their reading. Thus, these are the priorities in the instruction and become the high-impact skills. It's important to consider where these priorities are because we're always short on time, and not every activity or instruction is equal in terms of the amount of emphasis that we give it in our short time. So if these skills are in my grade level, I will make sure that blending and segmenting get the greatest emphasis. If I have a student with a need in phonological awareness, but it's not part of the core curriculum, because most students have already mastered it, then I would work on blending or segmenting in the targeted instruction. I might use isolation for a student who can't yet hear all the sounds in a word and isn't ready to work on blending or segmenting. But if the student is able to work on blending or segmenting, I'm not going to work on all of these skills during differentiated instruction. Similarly, I know that deletion and substitution are generally more difficult skills, but if there's no evidence, there's actually no evidence that you get better at reading by also mastering these skills. So I know that they're there. If I'm a kindergarten teacher or a first grade teacher and I'm teaching segmenting to all my students in the class, but I have a few students who pick it up quickly, I know that I can challenge them with some deleting and substituting types of activities by giving them words that they can do that with to challenge them. But those are skills I probably will not do with my struggling students because the highest impact on their reading achievement will come from truly mastering blending and segmenting. Within phonological awareness, there's a second aspect. There are different units of sound that students can work on within each of the previous skills. These are, again, in order, generally speaking, from least to most difficult. So I can ask students, for example, in segmenting, if I'm choosing segmenting, I can ask them to segment a sentence into whole words. The cat hid. Tell me, separate out each of the words in that sentence. I can do that with compound words. Segment baseball into its two smaller words. I can do that with syllables. Count out the syllables in learning, learn-ing. I can do that with onset rhyme, which is the onset is everything before the vowel, and the rhyme is the vowel and after. So in slat, the students would segment it into sul and at. Or I can do that at the phoneme level. What are the sounds in slat? S, ul, at. And phoneme is where the bang for your buck is. So once again, though there is one particular unit that's the most related to students' reading achievement, and that is the phoneme. The other units can be used for scaffolding for students that aren't ready to work on the phoneme level, but if students are ready for the phoneme, even if they haven't done syllables yet, I will work on the phoneme level with them. This is what will help them best access other aspects of the curriculum, and then I can use the easier skills to support them if they're not ready for that high-impact work yet. But I know that my goal is for that high-impact skill. So how can we apply this to other components of reading, which may be more applicable to your particular grade level? Let's start with phonics and word recognition. Take a few seconds, and based on the understanding and the example that I gave with phonological awareness, jot down what you think might be the practices that have the highest impact in phonics and word recognition. And we're right now kind of going across grade level, but you can do this within a grade level as well and look only at your standards and then identify the most high impact areas. So we already did some examples in phonological awareness. Another high impact skill, though, in phonological awareness is the integration. So we talked about the blending and segmenting and at the phoneme level. But one that I didn't provide in that example is the integration of the oral phoneme awareness with print in order to start connecting it to phonics and word recognition. And this is particularly needed for older students who still have a need in phonological awareness. Combining, so a third or a fourth grader who is still struggling with phonological awareness, combining instruction with the print is particularly valuable for accelerating their learning. Take a look at what you jotted down as high impact in phonics and word recognition, or what you thought about if you just did it in your head. It's probably not surprising to you that letter sounds, decoding, and work with irregular words are high priority. Spelling is often not integrated with decoding, however, but we know that students who can use sounds to read a word and also use those sounds and patterns in a word to spell the word are stronger readers. So practice with both reading decoding and spelling encoding is beneficial and can accelerate learning. For older students, check for instruction that includes strategies for multisyllabic words, often forgotten as well. Often when students grasp that basic decoding, word reading instruction ceases in the core, but many students can benefit from learning specific strategies for attacking multisyllabic words with this advanced instruction. And finally, in this area, consider whether there's lots of practice with text and applying all of these skills to text. Lack of sufficient opportunities for application of skills to text is a common problem in the core that can be examined for differentiated instruction. In the research of current instruction, we see that often students with reading difficulties receive less than a minute of text reading time in the early grades for application during their core instruction. And with that, it may not be surprising that they are struggling, and we can intervene at the core level to provide more instruction in just even that area. And that certainly relates to fluency. So now let's consider fluency. Take a few seconds to jot down what you think might be the practices that have the highest impact in fluency. In considering possible content for differentiating in the fluency area, the opportunities that students receive to read text, as we were just talking about, particularly in ways where they can receive feedback, is of the highest priority. When there is fluency practice, do students know the goal of the practice? So I want to read that section again and see if you can make it sound like we're talking or that you're talking, rather than getting with a partner and just saying, okay, get with a partner and read that story again. There's no goal there or reason for reading the story again, and it's unlikely as a result to improve their fluency. Students need a specific goal to work on to actually be improving their fluency. Modeling of fluent reading followed by student practice, as well as repeated reading of text, are ways to increase fluency if students know the goal again. So that goal goes with these other areas. So if I'm modeling, I'm asking them to listen for particular things in my fluency, and then I'm going to give them practice after that to try and sound like I did in those particular areas. For older students, there is some research to suggest that both continuous reading and repeated reading have the same outcomes. So if you're teaching in the upper elementary grades, it's more about the text reading for their fluency practice than it is specifically about repeated reading. So they can either repeatedly read chapters towards a particular goal, or they can read multiple chapters over the same amount of time and towards, again, their specific goal, and they will have the same outcomes. In the younger grades, the repeated reading has particular benefits. Importantly, fluency is related to comprehension. So when the reading is automatic for students and they are reading for meaning, we have to make sure that students are practicing reading fluently, but not just reading faster. So having students practice reading faster without these other components may be less effective. Try to use language that stays with the goal of fluent reading and does not suggest to students that it's a race without meaning. You noticed earlier in the example I said one goal that you can give students is to, okay, let's read that section again and see if you can make it sound like you're talking, rather than telling them to see if they can read it faster. Okay? So those are our high impact areas in fluency. Having a goal, modeling, repeated reading. For older students, continuous reading is also valuable. Making sure they're engaged and doing their best reading, not just their fastest reading. Let's consider vocabulary in thinking about high impact areas. Take a few seconds to think about or to jot down what you think might be the practices that have the highest impact in vocabulary. Okay, so in considering content instruction and differentiation, vocabulary instruction is another important area that is very often forgotten. Is vocabulary instruction occurring, and most importantly, is it going beyond abstract definitions? So are students receiving concrete instruction in the meaning of words, including examples and non-examples of the words and how it is used? Are there opportunities for the students to use the words in meaningful ways, including in their own language? Are words reviewed periodically, so there's repetition, to allow for mastery and for that repetition? Or do students learn the word and practice it one day or 1 week, but then never see it again? And are related words explicitly linked for students so they can make connections between words and concepts and use those words interchangeably in their reading and in their writing? If any of these areas is insufficient in the current core instruction, they may be areas to target for students who are struggling to improve their vocabulary and concept knowledge, and that can happen during our differentiated instruction with very targeted students if it's only a few students, or if it's many students in the class, it can happen. We can differentiate by emphasizing that within our core instruction for all of the students who need that. And then we have our reading component, comprehension, which of course is our ultimate goal. Take a few seconds, think again. What do you think within comprehension, after all of these examples, might be the practices that have the highest impact? The examples I'm going to give are going to go across grade levels because we have many people from different grade levels. However, you might want to think just within your grade level, which can also be done. So comprehension is a large area of content consideration for differentiating instruction. First, and most importantly, and it is why it's capitalized as well, you have to make sure that we have actual instruction occurring in comprehension and instruction in how to be a more strategic reader, to critically think, infer, and understand that text. Or sometimes we have activities that consist mainly of asking students questions to check their understanding, which may not allow them to get better at understanding it. That's more of an assessment. It can also be a model of how to ask questions, but if we don't go further than that, the students will have difficulty accelerating their learning and being able to really understand how you find the information to answer those questions. So some key instruction in how to monitor comprehension, including how to ask yourself questions, not just answer teacher questions, as you are reading, and how to determine the main idea or summarize would be a start. Those are really high impact skills. Monitoring your comprehension by asking questions and checking whether you're understanding, knowing how to identify the main idea, knowing how to summarize. And again, instruction for students in how to do that during the differentiated instruction if that is a need. Other considerations that could be tripping up some students is more time spent on activating background knowledge rather than building background knowledge. That may be appropriate if it's appropriate for most of the students in the class, but you might consider for students who are struggling ways in which in differentiated instruction you can target building of that same background knowledge that they don't have and therefore can't activate. A lack of background knowledge will affect comprehension significantly and thus is more of a high-impact skill. In fact, language, vocabulary types of areas, and oral language, as well as background knowledge, are the biggest areas that relate to students who have reading disabilities that continue through the grade levels. Are students getting instruction and practice with comprehending both narrative and expository text, or literary and informational text for the Common Core words? Or is the emphasis on one type of text with the expectation that students can just apply it to those other texts? So not just that they have access to those, but that they're getting some comprehension instruction in that text. And even if it's still main idea, it may be, they may need that instruction with the different type of text. For students with reading difficulties, specific instruction and practice in both types of text is beneficial to their learning. Okay, so those are our high impact areas, and that is, like I said, the main focus that we're going to have when we're considering content in differentiated instruction. What do the students need based on our assessments? Do I need to do that with many students, in which case it may be that I'm differentiating through emphasizing these high impact areas and spending more time on those than some of the lower impact areas? Or are there particular students that I need to target, perhaps in a small group, and I'm considering what to do with the instruction in that small group? Again, it's about their needs and then where the highest impact areas are, because if they can accelerate learning in that area, they will then be able to better access the core. So I'm going to share a few resources that are available to you for free when you're planning for high impact instruction in your differentiated instruction. The first is available on the Florida Center for Reading Research website, which can be found at fcrr.org, and you'll see it at the bottom there. This is a screenshot, but also you can see it in the upcoming slides as I go forward. fcrr.org has some free lessons for you to use once you've identified areas to target. And they are under the Empowering Teachers tab, which is why I'm showing you this. You see the VPK Learning Center activities. You see Student Center activities. Those are for skills that students have nearly mastered and can be working independently. Those can also be very valuable if you're doing targeted instruction and you need some new ideas for activities that students can do more independently in particular grade levels. But the one I'm talking right now is that third one, Empowering Teachers, and there is where the targeted lessons are. Sometimes there's some confusion, those of you who are familiar with this website, that the center activities provide targeted instruction, and they actually aren't designed for that. They are designed for more independent work, skills that students have nearly mastered. In fact, they're missing the instruction part. It's just a practice activity. But under Empowering Teachers, you'll find a few different things. There is guidance to determine strengths and weaknesses in each component, and an informal assessment that can supplement your formal assessments in making decisions for differentiated instruction, and instructional routines to target the specific area if you have students with that need, and those are the sort of mini lessons. So let me show you some of that. So once you click on Empowering Teachers, you'll be brought to this screen, which again on the left has several choices. And the how to differentiate instruction just has some basic information that we've been covering in this webinar. The questions to guide instruction is where you'll find some informal assessment that can supplement your formal assessments. And the instructional routines is where you will find the activities or lessons with instruction that can be used for particular student needs. So if you click on Questions to Guide Instruction, the screen looks like this, and you can see some informal assessments with questions. There's a Help Me Decide. If you click on that, it'll give you some ways to work informally with a student to see if they can, for example, compare and contrast topics, characters, settings, and problems, or whatever the question is. And you can actually link to the instructional routines right from this informal assessment as well, those PDFs. If you decide that that is an area that your student need some assistance with, then you can click right on the PDF and it will give you the targeted instruction in that area. And as I said, you can get straight to those PDFs if you go to the instructional routines link on the left there. Now these materials are currently on the FCRR website, which is fcrr.org again. They're only developed for K-3 skills and high impact areas there, meaning that they're good both for K-3 teachers as well as 4th and 5th grade teachers who have students that have an earlier grade need, which certainly can happen. Another resource, though, for upper elementary and students who aren't quite as far behind is the meadowscenter.org, and they have teacher resource books, including one that is specific to upper elementary grades that's filled with targeted lessons in every reading component, and that is meadowscenter.org. So this is just an example of one of the targeted lessons, this particular one in identifying cause and effect. Okay, now we're going to watch a video of some differentiated instruction of one teacher's classroom. This is a first grade class, and you will see that she has differentiated both the targeted small group instruction as well as the centers. Those are differentiated too, that the students work in when they are not in the targeted group. That is the most difficult way to differentiated instruction, and honestly not a way that I ever fully achieved. So if you're new to differentiated instruction or you're making adjustments in this area, trying to get new ideas and improve differentiated instruction, it's probably best to first consider the differentiation in the targeted groups before trying to also differentiate their centers. The centers should be work that is moving towards mastery, and so sometimes it can be helpful to differentiate those because students may be at different places in that. But focus first on accelerating the student learning in the teacher-directed groups. And that's where the most acceleration in learning can actually occur. During the video, I'd like you to consider the ways in which this teacher differentiates instruction and what instruction would be needed to allow the class to function this way. And I purposely chose a younger grade level because that can be the more difficult grade levels for managing small group differentiated instruction. But no matter what the grade level is, students need some instruction in order to function in that way. So consider both what the teacher is doing to differentiate instruction and what instruction is needed to allow the class to function the way that you see in this video. It's clearly not their first day doing this. Then, most importantly, I want you to see if you can find at least 2 ideas or aspects that you could plan to implement in differentiation in your core reading instruction. And of course, we're talking broadly here, not specific to what is the content that's being taught in this video or the grade level that's in this video. But what does this teacher do in the differentiation that might give you an idea or an aspect that you could plan to implement in differentiation in your core reading instruction? And I'm going to pass it over to Molly, who's going to play the video for us.
The second component of initial instruction is differentiated instruction. This reinforces skills and strategies learned during that whole group lesson, as well as other skills based on students' instructional needs. Differentiated instruction should target each child's individual level. During differentiated instruction, students can work with a teacher, but they can also complete activities on their own. Now, for this to work effectively, you've got to be organized and have a clear plan that both you and the students understand. On this chart, you can...
All right, I'm going to try it again, folks. Please make sure you don't have anything else running too when you're running the webinar, because sometimes that affects things.
On this chart, you can see Ms. Joseph has 4 groups, but often teachers meet with 3 groups a day for around 15 to 20 minutes per session. Now you can see the students are divided into groups, and there is a clear schedule of when they should be working with the teacher and when they should be in their small groups. You're probably going to have to take a good bit of time modeling the rotations of these centers, especially for younger students. This is important, though, because to make the needed learning gains, no time should be wasted during work in the student centers. In between sessions, you might need to roam the room to check the management, ensure the students understand the goals of the center, and make sure that they are still academically engaged. When deciding which centers to have in your classroom, remember, even though students are practicing skills at the centers, the activity should be within their zone of proximal development. This is the range within which a child can learn. At one end of the range are learning tasks they can complete independently. At the other end are learning tasks they can't complete, even with assistance. Well, in between these two extremes is the zone most productive for learning, the range of tasks in which children can achieve if they are assisted by a more knowledgeable or more competent student or teacher. And once again, students also have to be academically engaged and be held accountable for center work. This can be done through teacher feedback, supplying an answer key, or collaborative student discussion. One very important point to make here is that students should not be reading at their frustration level while at these centers. For it to be effective, students must be reading material that is at their independent or instructional level. So how do you decide which students belong in which group? Well, instructional decisions should be driven by data. Since Ms. Joseph teaches at a Reading First school, she uses the Dibbles assessment to monitor the progress of her students. Ms. Joseph uses scores from the report generated by the Progress Monitoring and Reporting Network, or PMRN. She also uses her observations and, when needed, diagnostic assessments to plan her instruction. Well, this way she can make sure that what she's teaching meets the needs of individual students. Since the needs change with instruction, her groups change often. Let's take a look at her class's most recent Dibbles scores to see how she forms her small groups. First of all, Ms. Joseph has 20 students in her class. From this report, we can see that 8 are considered high risk, 3 moderate risk, and 9 are low risk. Using the PMRN report as a guide, Ms. Joseph is going to place Mike, Chris, Kelsey, Alicia, and Rodney in Group 1. These students are at high risk of not achieving grade level reading by the end of the year and were below the benchmark level in oral reading fluency, nonsense word fluency, and phoneme segmentation fluency. This indicates the need for intensive work in phonemic awareness and phonics skills for this group. Let's take a look at Ms. Joseph's teacher-led and student centers. She has decided to use Elkonin boxes for this group in her teacher-led center. And notice that the sounds she's working with are taken from the day's whole group lesson. Loud, loud. There are also several student-led activities that would be suitable for this group. Some you might want to consider are using a storyboard.
Let me not by the mouth choo choo choo. And I hope, and I puff, and I blow your house down.
A phonemic rhyming game.
Do you have a word rhymes with jig? She. Pig. Do you have a word that rhymes with head, bed?
Or even hopscotch.
And the game. What is this picture? A basketball. Basketball. How many syllables in 3?
You can also use a technology-based literacy center, like a computer. For Group 2, Ms. Joseph selected Paulette, Jeffrey, Cassandra, and Katrina. You can see these students were below benchmark in oral reading fluency and nonsense word fluency. Also, their phoneme segmentation fluency is at moderate risk of not achieving grade level reading by the end of the year. Well, this shows they need intensive work in phonics skills and some continued work in phonemic awareness. So for Group 2, Ms. Joseph uses pocket charts and letters to help these students with word work. Once again, notice the words that she chooses directly reflect the day's whole group lesson.
I need to change the C to a H. Good job. Now we want to make ow, ow. I need to change the H to an N. Now let's sound this word out together. Ready? Ow, now. Good Good job. We need to make now, brow. This is a little difficult. It's 2 sounds before. Ready? Ow. Good. Let's check to see if everyone has it.
Some student-led centers that would be good for this group include, but aren't limited to, word puzzles,
apron, and actor. Spider, broken today.
onset rhyme, or dictation with a resource teacher who can actually be working in the general education classroom during this differentiated instruction.
This way. Write ow at the top. Neatly. Good job. Ow. Okay, and this time we're using OU. And the first word we're going to write is out.
What's that?
We need to write our first sound, out. And our next word is shout. Let's give everybody a chance.
Shout. H-O-U-T.
Another option for students could be rereading a decodable.
Brown and white. But Max was named Max. But Max was a grouch that put a large bone on the ground. Max puts a bone in his mouth, then he spits it out.
Ms. Joseph selected William, Jonathan, Devin, Lakia, Shauna, and Ricardo for Group 3. Well, these students were either at high or medium risk of not achieving grade level reading by the end of the year, according to their oral fluency scores. Well, this shows the need for intensive work in fluency building activities for this group. Now, also, by working with them in class, Ms. Joseph has observed which of these students need more fluency in decoding ability and which students need more help in recognizing words with irregular sound symbol correspondences. She's also going to do some work with Lakia and Ricardo on higher level phonemic awareness. She's using reader's theater as well as repeated readings with feedback to build fluency.
Reader's finger under scene 2 so you can know where we are and make sure you're following along with your fingers. The first part, the narrator has to introduce scene 2 so we can know what's going on. Narrator, you may begin reading.
Little size Billy Goat Gruff walked up to the rickety old bridge. He too sees the meadow with the green grass and apple trees. I want to go across this bridge to eat some green grass and apples so that I can be bigger like my brother. Trip, trap, trip, trap, trip, trap.
There are many ways to hold students accountable at centers. A few of them are allowing them to work on partner reading.
Is this a monster? No. Is this a monster? This is a monster.
And even go over sight words with a mentor or other volunteer. They can work with students during differentiated instruction or while other students receive immediate intensive intervention. But it is important their work is driven by the teacher's instruction, and it's not just busy work. This is sometimes most effective if mentors stay in the classroom. Mentors can use supplemental programs or teacher-created activities. Students in Group 3 also participate in choral reading.
I love going to the beach on vacation. Rock pools are a great place to look for crabs, but you have to be very quiet.
assisted reading.
Come to my first part. What kind?
Now on to the last group, number 4. Jose, Brianna, Victoria, Cheyenne, and Benjamin. These students are at low risk of not achieving grade level reading by the end of the year. However, they still need instruction that is differentiated to meet their needs. However, instruction for this group may not need to be as intense, frequent, or as long as the other groups. Ms. Joseph works with these students on semantic feature analysis, which is a vocabulary building activity. Notice she's taken the story and terminology directly from the whole group lesson.
The next one we have is the platypus. What do we remember about the platypus? Can anyone point to the platypus on this one? Good job, the platypus. What did we learn about the platypus?
It have a duck bill.
And what other animal is the platypus similar to, or what?
Duck.
A duck. It has what like a duck? A bill. Good job. What type of tail does a platypus have? A beaver tail. Now, is a platypus a mammal? No. Fish?
Yes.
Is a fish?
No.
Does it have feathers?
No.
Lives in the rainforest?
No.
Yes or no? Oh, does it live in swamps and rivers? Where does a platypus in river? Okay. All right.
In their small groups, students can work on a Venn diagram.
Which one goes in river, both, or ocean?
Reader's Theater.
As the weeks went by, the sun ripe the wheat until it was ready to harvest.
Will you help me harvest the wheat?
Not I.
It was too hot today. Pig, will you help me harvest the wheat?
Not I. It is too hot today.
They can have a book club.
This is the story about Zinga. It's this little girl who wanted to fight for her dad. She couldn't fight, and then her dad warriors died in the battle. She got trapped in some kind of castle.
And she have arrows. That's nice.
Or discuss story sequencing.
Middle.
Okay, so one of the things that you saw besides the content aspects, which we've been talking about today, is you might have heard her mention some organizational features that we had talked about last week of differentiated instruction. And of course, these can be used in tandem. So for example, some of the groups may need less time in the small group instruction or less intensity, as was mentioned in the video, allowing you to differentiate in that organizational way the amount of time that you spend with particular students, either within a session or even how many days a week you meet with a particular group. And so you can plan not only the content differentiation, but you don't necessarily have to meet with every group for the same amount of time or for the same number of days each week. In addition, one additional consideration for centers, if you're not differentiating the centers, as we talked about, if you're focusing on getting your targeted instruction well differentiated and accelerating student learning and getting that solid first, you can use heterogeneous small groups for your centers, have all of the students go to the centers, and then call your targeted group for the teacher direction. And in the younger grades, that can sometimes be helpful because it also gives you a chance in between groups, send the students back to their heterogeneous groups. It gives you a chance to walk around, make sure students are on track with what they're doing, check their work, give some feedback before you then have them switch centers and call your targeted group again. Heterogeneous groups at the centers make it more likely that students, someone at that center remembers what they are supposed to be doing and can help each other in that aspect as well. So that's another way to organize your differentiated instruction so that you can focus on your targeted groups. All right, so as we discussed, this teacher, the teacher that we just watched on the video differentiated the centers as well. And if your targeted instruction is working well for your students, it is accelerating the students, you're not overwhelmed by just the planning of that, which I always was, and you're interested in also differentiating centers for students, you can find ideas both on the fcrr.org, where I pointed out the tab or the left menu choice for center activities, student center activities, as well as in this document that's listed here. This is a PDF. It's on the Center on Instruction website. It's another free resource. If you've never been on that website, they have many, many instructional aspects, both for reading. They happen to also have math, English language learners, special education, students with disabilities, and many resources available there. But they do have this document as part of that, which is a document specific to center activities. And so you might be interested in that if you want some additional ideas there. Okay. So there's one key area that I want to also make sure as we're thinking about this differentiation that you don't forget, and that is when considering the differentiated instruction, we spend a lot of time thinking about the student needs, thinking about where the high impact priorities are, which is what we've covered a lot today through the content considerations, and that initial instruction that students need to accelerate their learning. But don't forget the review aspect as well. Students need much review, particularly if they are struggling readers. So you can accelerate their learning, but if you then move on without continuing to maintain that previous learning, they may fall back very quickly, and I'm sure many of you have seen that with some students. So be sure to incorporate cumulative and varied review within your differentiated instruction, particularly of the new concepts or practices that were taught in your core instruction, as well as support with organizing the different aspects of knowledge that you're teaching your students. So another way to accelerate learning in a high-impact area is to help students as you're introducing and they're starting to master new content, help them with how to relate that to previous content. We saw that in vocabulary. It's really important to relate words and help students see categories of words that go together. But that's true with larger concepts too. So for example, how does phonics instruction connect with their spelling instruction? Why do we do both of those areas and how do they go together? I mentioned earlier that spelling is a very important part, a high-impact area of phonics and word recognition instruction, but it actually is only high impact if it is connected with the phonics instruction. So not a spelling list that they get on Monday and they memorize and they take a test on Friday, but instead, if we're learning about these sounds, we're learning about what OU says, ow, and we're learning how to read words with that, also making sure that students are learning how to spell words with that, and that they understand that if they hear the sounds, they can write the letters that go with that sound. And students who can go back and forth between seeing letters and knowing their sounds, and hearing sounds and knowing the letters that go with them are the strongest readers. And so that is a really high impact area that we can incorporate and help them see those connections. Another way to organize knowledge, or another example, is helping students see how main idea and summarizing are related. That a summary is often each of the main ideas within a passage and putting those together into a summary. So making sure that we not only review and have those cumulative and varied review so that they continue to maintain and master those areas, but also helping them organize so that they're not just learning each of these isolated bits together. Okay, so we have covered 2 of our differentiated instruction categories. Last week we discussed the organizational ways to differentiate, including time and group size, and we talked a little today about how that could also be used within our how we can combine that within our second area, which was the content considerations. including targeting student strengths and weaknesses and considering the high impact skills. So these two categories can be used together to differentiate instruction. And next week, we're going to cover the final category, which is instructional delivery considerations that almost certainly have to be used with content considerations in order to most effectively accelerate learning. They are also, generally speaking, in most core instruction and even in some intervention instruction, the most forgotten in terms of things that we can do to differentiate there. Okay. So now we have some time for questions, and there's been a few that have occurred as we've been going on today. So I'm going to start with those, and if you have questions while I'm going over those, please feel free to type them in, and I'll try to get to as many as we can. We certainly have plenty of time. Okay, so one question was related to managing the classroom for differentiated instruction with small groups, and that's always a common question, particularly as you have a very wide range of abilities within a particular grade level or a particular class. You get to a point where you even more so want to make sure you're using these small groups because it's difficult to target when you have that wide range if you're only doing whole class or partner work. And so I asked you personally to consider, one of the questions for the video even was to consider what would it take to get the students to function in the way that you saw on the video. And basically you have to teach students how to do the centers the same way you would teach any other reading skill or math skill or concept that you're teaching. So you actually have lessons at the beginning of the year and some review, because that's important too, where you go through, this is how we do the center, what should you do if you have questions, what do you do if you finish, and you practice it. And you practice just that aspect of it, one step at a time over several days. More time for the youngest students. So those first graders, it was a good week of just practicing those aspects and doing a little bit of instruction with that. But it sets you up for a lot more instructional time later because you're not continually having to fix that. In addition, as I mentioned earlier, consider using heterogeneous groups at your centers and just pulling your targeted small groups from the centers. And just the younger the student, the more explicit that instruction needs to be for the centers, and the more days it might take at the beginning of the year, and then just some quick reviews. Older students can get the idea a little bit easier, but you also don't want to just start right away with it and assume that they know that. Another question was, why not teach in small groups for all of core reading instruction? That's an interesting idea, and only teaching in small groups may not be the most efficient, though, for all of our instruction, particularly at many of the grade levels. First, there's some areas where all students need the content or the information, and a whole group may actually be more efficient and allow more students to be engaged in getting that content. Similarly, partners may fill this role better if students are practicing and all of them need to practice. That would be a more efficient way to get at that particular, perhaps some fluency work. In addition, you want to balance the amount of time that students are in instruction and practice with teacher support, because that's where the true acceleration occurs. So if the majority of their time is spent in independent practice when they're not with their targeted groups, then their learning is not likely to be accelerated as quickly as it could be. Another question asked about, are Morphemes and Graphemes important to teach elementary students? Well, Graphemes is what we went over with the phonics and word recognition and the high impact priority areas. And absolutely, so yes, matching the print to the sound. So the print is the grapheme and the sound is the phoneme. And that includes everything from individual letter sounds to letter combinations like the OU or SH, to affixes as well, prefixes and suffixes. So all those graphemes and the sounds that go with them is a high impact area for students to accelerate their learning. In terms of morphemes, there's limited evidence at the elementary level, but it is building, and certainly understanding the meaningful roots and affixes that make up words in the language is important, particularly as students start to get into multisyllabic words. And we talked about a high impact area in the upper grades in 3rd and 4th and 5th grade is to focus on providing strategies for students to identify and decode multisyllabic words. You don't want them to attack multisyllabic words by going sound by sound. And many students will say that they just skip big words because they don't have those strategies. So really high impact area, there's different ways to do it. Some of you may be familiar with the 6 syllable types. Teaching those is one way to teach a strategy. Another is to teach students about the roots and affixes and to have kind of a 3-step strategy where you see a multisyllabic word, you look for prefixes, you look for suffixes, you look at the base word or the root word and sounds that you know, and then you put them together. There's not a particular strategy that is the best. High impact is just that students are being taught a strategy and are getting practice using that strategy. Another question came up related to how do you build fluency? And that was those high impact areas of fluency that I had on the slide when we went over each of the components are the areas that we know the most about for building fluency, and those were first that you work on fluency, you have time spent on that. Remember early in the webinar I asked you to think about for each of the components, what do you know about how much time daily or weekly is spent in each area? So making sure that there's time for that, that students have a goal that works towards fluency, not that they're just being told to read text, but they have an actual goal towards that. Repeated reading, and for older kids also just continuous reading with that goal. Modeling of fluency. And all of these can also be done in some of the pre-skills as well as in text. So for example, if I'm a kindergarten teacher, working on fluency of just knowing your letter sounds or fluency of decoding words. You use the same sort of process in the sense that there's a goal and we have activities that are specific towards the fluency aspect, not just the accuracy aspect. But you can do that with skills even before students are reading connected text. Or for students who are really struggling, that may be what's affecting some of their fluency, is that they're just not strong enough in those initial skills. And so even if I'm a 4th grade teacher and I have a student who's significantly struggling with fluency and I see that even reading words isolated, not in text, is not very fluent for that student, I might practice fluency not in the connected text but in those pre-skills, and then as quickly as possible apply it to the connected text. Okay, let's see. We've had a couple additional questions here. Let's see if I can, it's hard to both talk and read the questions at the same time. Somebody asked, are these centers done at a different time of the day from the guided reading? I'm not sure what the guided reading is. If you mean the targeted small groups, they were done at the same time, and the video that you were seeing, as well as some of the examples that I gave previously, were all within the core reading instruction. And you know, it depends both on your grade level and your district and state standards in terms of the amount of time for that. The video that you saw, she teaches a 90-minute core reading instruction, and the small groups are about 40 minutes of that. We saw, I believe there was a question last week about how to sort of organize that. Sometimes, of course, core can be 120 minutes, and some of the upper grades core is sometimes 60 minutes. It depends on what the standards are specific for that. But you can divide that between your whole class instruction, where that's the most efficient, your targeted small group instruction. Perhaps there's places where partners, certainly independent work, are appropriate, and dividing up that time accordingly. And thinking about dividing up the reading components that are appropriate for your grade level too. Somebody asked, how do you infuse Common Core learning standards into this model? All standards can be fit into this model. In fact, that's one of the reasons I was giving a couple of examples specifically related to Common Core. So what you're trying to do with differentiated instruction is look at your standards, including the Common Core standards for your grade level, and say, okay, here are areas where a lot of students are struggling. And so I need to think about where's the high impact areas that I can emphasize. So for example, when I was giving that phonological awareness example, across time, I'm thinking I don't always want to be spending 10 minutes on phonological awareness. Rather, I want to make sure that I've got more days or more time when we're specifically working on blending and segmenting, and I can have less time or less days on some of the other skills that I'm using just for scaffolding to get there. Similarly, if I just have a few students struggling, what I'm trying to do is help students better access the standards, better access the core that will help them meet those standards. And if they're missing some key foundational skills, for example, I will use the targeted small group time to address those skills so that, and again, thinking about just the high impact areas because I want to accelerate that learning so that they have the foundation they need to be able to benefit from the standards. So all of the high impact areas that we talked about are in the standards, and the thinking about this is how you're helping them access those standards the best. And let's see if we have any others. And if I have missed your question, please don't think that I've purposely missed it. You're welcome to retype it. Like I said, it's sometimes hard with all the different chats to catch all the questions. Let's see here. I'm not sure I'm seeing any others. Molly, is there any that you saw that I should make sure to address?
No, I know a couple people asked about the video, but I don't believe we can post it because of copyright. I don't know if you know who the publisher is for the video, if you want to share that, or where they might be able to find it. But we did have a couple people ask about the video.
Sure, absolutely. So the video was actually made by the state of Florida and was publicly available, but they are in the process of creating new ones, and I believe they've pulled it down, so there isn't a place to access that. But the PowerPoint will be available, and the center activities and other ideas can be found in those resources that I shared with you from fcrr.org and the Center on Instruction.
Yeah, and the PowerPoint is on our webpage. I've posted it a couple times, but it's nysrti.org. And then if you go under Professional Development and Webinars, you'll find it listed under the webinar title for today. We will also post a link to the recording there as well. So thank you all so much for attending. I'm going to post the link to the evaluation, and we really appreciate you taking a few minutes to complete that. And thank you so much, Dr. Wanzek.
Thank you. I hope everybody has a good evening.
Audio recording for this meeting has ended.